People in the kingdom whispered that the vampire king had no heart left. They said his soul was colder than the stones of his ancient castle, and that anyone who stepped inside never returned the same. But no one knew how heavy his nights truly were, or how quietly he watched his sleeping son and wished, just once, to feel like a normal father. The castle dining hall glowed with low, amber light from 100 candles, their flames bending in the draught like frightened servants. Shadows clung to the black stone walls, and the long wooden tables were nearly empty, except for a few loyal guards pretending not to be afraid of the man sitting alone at the head. He wore a crown of dark metal that caught the candlelight but did not shine. His eyes, a deep crimson that once made armies tremble, now simply looked tired. He was the vampire king, ruler of a kingdom that stayed awake at night and hid from the sun, master of storms and secrets. Yet in that moment, he seemed less like a monster and more like a man who had run out of ways to pretend he was not breaking inside. His fingers tapped once against the arm of his throne, then stilled, as if even the sound of his own impatience annoyed him. Beyond the tall windows, the sky was a deep blue-black, heavy with clouds. A soft rain began to fall, whispering against the glass. From the far end of the hall, the faint sound of wheels squeaking on stone echoed closer and closer. The king did not move, but his eyes sharpened. He knew that sound. He heard it in his dreams. A small wheelchair, carefully pushed by an elderly vampire nurse, appeared in the doorway. In the chair sat his son, Prince Errol, wrapped in a dark velvet blanket. The boy's legs were thin and motionless, his body smaller than it should have been for his age. Errol's head rested slightly to one side, his neck too weak to hold it straight for long, but his eyes, those bright, storm-gray eyes, searched the hall as if he was always looking for a world beyond the walls. The guards lowered their gaze, pretending they did not see the prince's struggles. No one was allowed to speak of the curse that had left the vampire king's only child unable to walk, sometimes unable to even lift his own arms. It was the one topic that could turn the king's calm silence into a dangerous storm. "Stop there," the king said quietly, his voice low but carrying through the hall like a soft thunder. The nurse obeyed, parking the wheelchair a respectful distance from the throne. The boy stared at his father, a slow, shy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if just being near him made the pain a little smaller. The king studied his son, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, the sight tore at him in a way nothing else could. For centuries he had ruled through fear, never needing anyone, never bowing to anyone's will. But here, in this frail child who could not even stand, lived the only person who could break his heart with a single blink. "Errol," he said softly, almost as if tasting the name, "you should be resting." "I wanted to see you," the boy whispered, his voice airy and thin, each word an effort. His small hands clutched the edges of the blanket, his fingers trembling. The king's jaw tightened. He wanted to go to him, to lift him out of that chair and hold him like he had when Errol was a baby and the curse had not yet fully shown itself. But centuries of being feared had built walls around him. Even his love felt dangerous, like a weapon that might cut if held too tightly. "Enough for tonight," the king decided, waving one hand slightly. "Take him back to his room." The nurse nodded, stepping behind the wheelchair again. For a heartbeat, disappointment flickered in Errol's eyes, but he did not complain. He had learned very early that his father carried his love in silence. As the chair turned, one of the heavy side doors opened with a hesitant creak. Every head in the hall turned. A girl stood there, frozen in place. She wore a simple, faded dress and an apron stained with soup and breadcrumbs. Her hair was tied back messily, and loose strands stuck to her cheeks from the kitchen's steam. In her hands, she held a silver tray that shook just enough for the cups to clink softly against each other. She was human. The king's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Humans were allowed in his territory now under strict agreements, working in the outer village taverns and farms, but they were never brought this close to him. The guards tensed, hands resting on their weapons out of habit, though no one moved without his command. The girl swallowed hard, obviously realizing she had stepped into the wrong part of the castle. Her gaze darted from the king's throne to the prince's wheelchair, and for a moment, something gentle and painfully human flashed across her face. It was not fear, not yet. It was recognition, pity, a kind of quiet, aching understanding that had nothing to do with kingdoms or curses. Before anyone could stop her, one of the castle maids hurried in behind the girl, whispering sharply, "You took the wrong turn, Rosa. This is the royal." But she stopped mid-sentence, seeing that it was too late. The king had already risen halfway from his throne, not in anger, but in stunned surprise. His gaze was fixed on a single, impossible sight, the human girl taking one hesitant step closer to the prince, the tray still shaking in her hands, her eyes softening even more at the boy's fragile form. And then it happened faster than any of them could react. The wheelchair's small front wheel caught on a crack in the ancient stone floor. The chair jerked forward just enough for Errol's weak body to slip sideways. His hand slid off the armrest, his head dropping, his fragile weight tipping toward the cold ground. The elderly nurse cried out, reaching, but her old joints were too slow. The guards froze, torn between fear of moving without orders and fear of the child falling. Time seemed to stretch into a terrible, silent eternity, and in that frozen heartbeat, the mighty vampire king's eyes widened with a raw, helpless terror he had never allowed anyone to see. The first person to move was not a guard, not the nurse, not even the king. It was the human waitress. The tray crashed to the floor, cups shattering around her feet as she threw it aside without a second thought. She lunged forward, arms outstretched, her steps slipping slightly on the spilled liquid. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the hall as she slid across the stone and reached the prince just as he began to fall out of the chair. Her hands caught him, clumsy, desperate, but achingly gentle. She pulled his small body against her chest, bracing the back of his head with one hand, wrapping the other around his shoulders as if he were the most precious thing she had ever held. Errol gasped, startled, then clung to her instinctively, his weak fingers curling into her apron. His breathing was shallow, but he was safe. The hall went silent. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. The vampire king stood completely still, his cloak hanging like a dark shadow around him, staring at the sight no one in his kingdom had ever imagined. His disabled son, trembling in the arms of a human girl, held as if he were nothing less than someone worth risking everything for. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The guards looked from their king to the girl, waiting for the explosion of rage, for the storm they were sure would come. The nurse's hands hovered, unsure whether to take the boy back or step away and let the moment stand. Rosa did not seem to notice any of them. Her eyes were focused only on the child in her arms. "It's okay," she whispered, voice shaking but kind. "I've got you, you're safe, I won't let you fall." Errol's eyes shimmered, a small tear gathering in the corner as he stared up at her face. No one had ever held him like that in front of so many eyes, unafraid, unashamed of his weakness. The king took one slow step down from his throne, then another, the sound of his boots on the stone floor echoing like distant thunder. His face was unreadable, his crimson eyes fixed on the human girl cradling his son as if she had any right to touch royal blood, let alone the blood of a vampire king. Rosa finally realized where she was, who was watching her, and her breath hitched. She looked up, meeting the king's gaze for the first time. Her arms tightened protectively around the boy, not in defiance, but in pure instinct, as if even facing a legendary monster, her first thought was still to shield the child in her care. For a heartbeat that felt like the whole world holding its breath, human and vampire, king and servant, father and stranger were locked in a single, fragile moment. The king stopped just a few steps away, so close now that Rosa could see the thin cracks of pain behind his cold, red eyes. The entire hall waited for his judgment. His lips parted, a question, a command, something heavy and dangerous forming in his throat. But when he finally spoke, his voice was not what anyone expected. It was softer, and the words that left his mouth, quiet, trembling at the edges with something that might have been fear, would change everything that came after. He looked at the human girl, holding his disabled child, and asked, barely above a whisper, "Why are you holding him like that?" People would later say the question sounded like an accusation, like a king defending his pride. But in that moment, up close, it didn't sound like power at all. It sounded like a man who had never understood the way gentle hands could hold what he loved. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. Every story she had heard about the vampire king rushed into her mind, about his cruelty, his thirst, his cold eyes. But looking at him now, she didn't see a legend. She saw a father who was terrified to blink. She swallowed. "Because he was falling," she answered softly, her Spanish accent wrapping around the words. "Someone had to catch him." A guard twitched, as if prepared to drag her away for daring to speak so plainly. The king lifted one finger, and the guard froze in place. The hall stayed suspended, no one daring to interfere. "That is not what I asked," the king replied. His voice was still calm, but there was a tiny crack in it, like ice under too much weight. "Why are you holding him like that?" Rosa glanced down at the boy in her arms. Errol's face was pale, but his breathing was steadier now. He stared up at her with wide eyes, as if he could not believe anyone outside his father would dare to hold him at all. "Like what?" she asked, almost in a whisper. The king studied the way her hand cradled the back of Errol's head, the way her other arm wrapped securely around his small body, the way she rocked ever so slightly without realizing it, calming him as a mother would calm a frightened child. It was a kind of touch this hall had not seen in centuries. "Like he is," the king hesitated. His throat worked, and his expression tightened, as if saying the next words cost him something personal. "Fragile." Rose's eyebrows lifted just a little. "Isn't he?" she asked. There was no sarcasm, no challenge, just honest confusion. "He is a child. Children are always fragile, even the strong ones." The king blinked slowly, as if the idea did not fit into the world he knew. No one had ever spoken to him this way. His own court tiptoed around him, measuring every word. But this human waitress, with soup stains on her apron and fear in her veins, spoke the plain, simple truth as if he were just another man in a crowded tavern. Errol shifted slightly, a small sound escaping his lips. Rosa immediately adjusted her grip, moving one hand under his legs to keep them from dangling unsupported. Her movements were awkward but instinctive. She knew nothing about royal etiquette. She only knew the weight of a child in her arms. "I'm sorry, my king," she added, realizing how this must look. "I did not mean to offend. I just couldn't let him hit the floor." The king's jaw clenched. Memories rose in him like ghosts. Memories of watching Errol fall as a baby, hearing healers whisper about the curse, seeing the boy's legs fail him again and again. He had always ordered more guards, more protections, more rules. He had never considered that sometimes, instead of walls, a child needed arms. "Give him to me," the king said quietly. Rose's breath caught. Every instinct told her to obey immediately, to hand the boy back and step as far away as she could. But Errol's thin fingers tightened around the fabric of her apron. He looked up at his father, then at her, and in that tiny movement, Rosa felt him silently begging, "Don't let go so fast." Rosa had been poor her whole life. She knew what it was like when no one stayed long enough to make you feel safe. She nodded respectfully. "Of course," she answered. Her voice trembled only a little. "But please be careful. His back is straining from the way he almost fell." A murmur rippled through the hall. A human, telling the vampire king how to hold his own son. The king stepped closer. For the first time, he allowed himself to really look at the human girl, not as an intruder, not as a threat, as someone who had moved faster than his entire guard to keep his son from breaking. Up close, he could see the way her hands shook, not from weakness, but from adrenaline. He could smell the faint scent of bread, broth, and something else, salt from dried tears that did not belong to this moment. She had cried for other reasons before tonight. "How long have you been working in my castle?" he asked. Rosa carefully began to guide Errol toward him, following his instructions on how to support the boy's neck and legs. 2 weeks, my king, in the kitchens, washing dishes, serving food. I'm not supposed to be here." Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and fear. "I took the wrong corridor. I got lost." Errol coughed once and both of them paused, focusing on him. The king reached out his arms and Rosa slowly transferred the boy into them. To her surprise, his grip was steady and sure. He had carried this weight many times. He was not clumsy with his son, just distant. Errol relaxed against his father's chest, comforted by the familiar scent and the sound of his heart, slower than a human's, but strong. The king adjusted his hold exactly as Rosa had suggested, supporting the fragile spine, protecting the limp legs. Rosa let her hands drop to her sides. Without the boy's weight, they felt strangely empty. "You were not supposed to be here," the king repeated thoughtfully, but now his tone had changed. It was not accusation. It was curiosity, maybe even something like gratitude he did not yet know how to show. "And yet you were the only one close enough to catch my son when he fell." The guards shifted uncomfortably. The nurse stared at the floor, guilt tightening her shoulders. Rosa lowered her gaze. "Sometimes, the wrong turn is the only one that leads to the right place," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. The king watched her, the corner of his mouth twitching almost imperceptibly. There was a strange wisdom in this girl whose life was measured in shifts and wages, not in centuries. "What is your name?" he asked. "Rosa," she answered. "Rosa Alvarez." She swallowed again. "I come from the human village beyond the northern forest. We signed the treaty." Her voice softened as she looked at Errol. "I promised my mother I would send money home. She is sick. I have 2 little brothers." Her words hit him in a place no blade could reach. Family, responsibility, people depending on someone who already felt exhausted. Part of him wanted to dismiss her, to retreat behind the cold armor that had protected him for so long. But there was something about the way she had moved without thinking of herself that made that armor feel heavier than usual. Errol tugged weakly at his father's cloak. The king looked down. "Father," the boy whispered, glancing toward Rosa. She held me like Mama used to." The hall froze. The king's hand tightened gently on his son's shoulder. The word hit him like a blow. Mama, the queen, the woman he had loved beyond reason, lost to the same curse that now lived in their son's weak body. She had been human when he met her. He looked back at Rosa slowly, as if seeing her through 2 timelines at once, the present and the shadow of a past that still ached. "You may leave," he said at last, though his eyes lingered on her with a complexity no one could read. "Return to your duties." A wave of relief rushed through the guards. They had expected worse. Rosa bowed her head, grateful to still be breathing, her legs almost too weak to move. "Yes, my king," she whispered. As she turned to go, she felt Errol's eyes on her. She gave him a tiny, secret smile, one only a child would catch, and then stepped over the broken glass, carefully avoiding the sharp edges. As the heavy doors closed behind her, the hall exhaled. But the vampire king did not sit back down. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, his son in his arms, staring at the door where the human girl had just disappeared. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping insistently against the windows, as if the night itself were demanding that he make a choice. The king looked down at Errol's pale face, at the thin arms that clung to him, then back at the now empty doorway. "Send a message to the kitchens," he said suddenly. The nearest guard straightened. "Yes, my lord, what shall I?" "Tell them," the king interrupted quietly, "that from this night forward, no human servant is to be punished for entering the inner hall by mistake." His eyes darkened with decision. "And there is one human girl I want found." The guard blinked. "Found, my lord." "Rosa Alvarez," the king said. "I want her brought to me tomorrow before sunset." He did not explain why. He did not have to. Because somewhere between the crash of the tray and the fragile weight of his son in human arms, the unthinkable had happened. The vampire king had felt something in his chest shift. And that small, dangerous movement would not be easy to ignore. The hall fell silent again, but it was a different silence now. Charged, waiting, like the air before a storm that might destroy or cleanse. The castle kitchens roared with life the next evening, long before the sun's last light disappeared behind the mountains. Pots clanged, knives chopped, and the smell of roasted vegetables, garlic, and fresh bread mixed with the sharp scent of wood smoke. Human and vampire workers moved around each other with practiced distance, careful not to get too close, careful not to make eye contact for too long. Rosa kept her head down at the wash basin, scrubbing plates until her fingers ached and the warm water turned cloudy. Her mind was not in the kitchen. It kept replaying last night. The fall, the catch, the king's eyes, the way Errol had held onto her apron like it was a lifeline. "You're doing it again," murmured Marta, an older woman washing vegetables beside her. "Staring at nothing." Rosa blinked and forced a small smile. "I'm just tired." Marta snorted softly. "We are all tired, Nina, but not all of us almost walk into the throne hall." Her eyes softened with concern. "They say the king could have had you punished, or worse." Rosa's hands paused under the water. "He didn't," she said quietly. "Perhaps because you saved his boy," Marta whispered, lowering her voice so the nearby vampire overseer couldn't hear. "Still, be careful. These nobles, they don't thank people like us. They forget we have names." Before Rosa could answer, the kitchen door swung open. The room instantly quieted. A vampire guard in dark armor stepped inside, his presence dropping a heavy weight over the warm, busy air. His gaze swept the room. "Rosa Alvarez," he announced. Marta stiffened. Rosa's heart lurched, but she raised her hand slightly. "Here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You are summoned by the king," the guard said. "Now." The word summoned echoed in Rosa's skull. Hands around her stopped working. Humans avoided her gaze. A few looked at her with pity, others with fear. Marta's fingers squeezed Rosa's arm under the water. "Say as little as possible," she whispered quickly. "Keep your eyes low. Survive the moment. That's all that matters." Rosa nodded once, dried her hands on her apron, and followed the guard out of the kitchen. Every step down the corridor felt heavier than the last. The stone walls were lined with torches that flickered in the cool draft, casting long, wavering shadows. Somewhere deep in the castle, distant voices and footsteps echoed like memories. Her palms were sweating by the time they reached the same massive doors that led into the inner hall. The guard pushed them open, and the sight inside stole her breath all over again. The candles were lit, but fewer than last night, casting a more intimate, softer light. There were no crowds of guards this time, no court audience. The hall felt strangely empty, as if it had taken a deep breath and had not yet exhaled. At the far end, the vampire king sat on his throne, but he was not alone. Prince Errol was next to him, not in his wheelchair this time, but propped up carefully on a pile of cushions, wrapped in a dark blue cloak. A small table stood in front of him with carved wooden animals and little painted figures, soldiers, horses, tiny trees. His thin fingers rested lightly on one of them, as if he had been playing before she entered. The king's gaze found her the moment she stepped inside. "Leave us," he ordered the guard. "My lord, with respect." "I said, leave us," the king repeated, a quiet steel in his voice that left no room for doubt. The guard bowed stiffly and backed out of the room, closing the heavy doors behind him. The echo of wood against stone rang out like a sealed fate. For the first time since she entered the castle, Rosa found herself alone with the vampire king and his son. Her pulse raced, but she stepped forward until she stood a respectful distance from the dais. "You sent for me, my king," she said, bowing her head. Errol's face lit up with recognition. "Rosa," he breathed, his voice full of that small, bright wonder only children carried so easily. "You came back." Rosa couldn't help the gentle smile that touched her lips. "You say that like I had a choice," she replied softly, then caught herself. "I mean..." The king's mouth curved just barely upward. It was not quite a smile, but it was no longer the cold, distant mask she had seen when she first entered this castle. "You speak freely," he observed. "Most in your position do not." Rosa felt her cheeks warm. "Most in my position are smarter," she said before she could stop herself, then winced. Errol let out a small, breathy laugh. The sound was so pure that even the king's expression softened. "Come closer," the king said. Rosa obeyed, walking until she stood at the base of the dais. Up close, she could see the details she had missed before. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint, almost invisible scars along his hands, the way he sat a little too straight, as if his spine had forgotten how to relax. "I owe you something," he said. The words were so unexpected that Rosa almost thought she had misheard. "You owe me, my king." "Yes," his gaze stayed steady. "You caught my son before he broke himself on the stone my ancestors thought was strong enough to hold an empire. That is a debt." Rosa shook her head slightly. "I don't want anything," she said quickly. "I did what anyone would do." "No," the king replied. "You did what almost no one did. My own guards hesitated. You moved." His crimson eyes studied her. "What do you want?" The question knocked the breath out of her more than any threat would have. What she wanted. The list in her heart was long and heavy. Her mother healed, her brothers safe, enough food, a life without fear. But all of that felt too large, too personal to throw at a king who could snap her life in half with a word. "Nothing, my king," she repeated quietly. "I have a job. That is already more than many have." He tilted his head slightly. "Humility is a shield for those who expect punishment," he said. "You expect to be hurt for what you did. You should not." Rosa met his gaze for a fraction of a second. "With respect in your hall, my king, should and should not do not always matter." Errol watched them both, his eyes darting back and forth, not fully understanding the weight of their words, but feeling the tension in the air. "Father," Errol whispered, can she stay, just for a little while?" The king shifted his attention to his son. "Why do you want her to stay?" he asked. Errol fidgeted with one of the wooden figures. "Because, when I was falling, it didn't feel like falling," he said slowly, searching for the right words. "It felt like someone knew how to hold me, like I was broken." Rosa's throat tightened. She had grown up with little, but even she had rarely heard a child speak with that kind of longing. The king's eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, there was a quiet decision in them. "Rosa Alvarez," he said, his voice carrying softly through the hall. "From this night onward, you are assigned to the prince's service as his companion and attendant. You will split your duties between the kitchens and his chambers, until I say otherwise." Rosa stared, stunned. "My king, I'm not trained to care for nobles. I'm only..." "You are trained," he cut in gently, "in the one skill that matters most. You know how to hold a child who is falling." He said it like a fact that could not be argued with. Errol's face lit up. You mean she can really stay with me? He asked, looking between them. Yes, the king said simply. Rose's practical fear fought with a strange, fragile warmth in her chest. My king, she said carefully, the other servants, the other nobles, they will not like it, a human this close to the prince. He leaned forward slightly. They are not raising my son, he said quietly. I am, and I... He hesitated, as if the next words were heavier than the crown on his head. I am not enough alone. The admission settled between them like something sacred. Rose's breath hitched. She had never imagined hearing a king say such a thing. Kings were supposed to be invincible, complete, never in need. For a long moment, no one spoke. The candles flickered softly. The distant rain had stopped, leaving only the quiet hum of the night. Finally, Rosa nodded. Then I will do my best, she said, for him. She glanced at Errol and gave him a small, steady smile. If you'll have me, little prince. Errol beamed. I already do, he said. The king watched the exchange, something unnameable in his eyes. Then he rose from his throne, lifted Errol gently, and handed him carefully toward Rosa. Not like last night in a moment of panic, but deliberately, as if he were passing her something priceless. She took the boy into her arms, already adjusting him the way she had before, one hand under his legs, the other supporting his back. Errol settled against her as if this was the most natural place in the world for him to be. The king stepped back and studied the picture they made. A human girl in a faded apron, holding a cursed prince with the tenderness of someone who had no throne, no power, but an endless, quiet strength. For the first time in a long time, something inside him loosened. Rosa, he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. Do you believe a child like him can be happy? Rosa looked down at Errol, who was tracing the pattern on her sleeve with clumsy but determined fingers. She thought of her own brothers, one of them born with a twisted foot, mocked by other children, protected fiercely by her. Yes, she said firmly. If he is loved and not hidden, if he is allowed to laugh, if someone sits on the floor with him and doesn't rush away. The king let out a slow breath. No one has ever spoken to me about him that way, he admitted. Maybe, Rosa answered gently. No one ever thought you would listen. Her words cut, but they also healed in a strange way. He had built walls so thick that even those who cared had stopped trying to reach him. Silence wrapped around them again, not cold, not sharp, but tentative and warm. In that silence, a new kind of story began to write itself. One where a vampire king learned from a human waitress how to be less of a legend and more of a father. One where a disabled prince learned that his worth was not measured in the strength of his legs, but in the strength of the arms that chose to hold him. One where the lines between human and vampire, servant and king, curse and blessing began to blur. And though none of them knew how dangerous that story might become, none of them stepped away from it. Not that night. Not after what had already started to change. The first time Rosa took Errol outside, the entire castle paused to watch. It was a few nights after her new assignment began. She had learned the routines quickly, the prince's medicines, his stretches, the way his breathing changed when he was too tired. She had learned where the stones in the corridor were uneven, which turns to avoid, how to lift him without straining his fragile muscles. She had also learned something else. Errol almost never saw the sky. He lived between his room and the inner hall, surrounded by stone and candlelight. The windows in his chambers were tall and narrow, but they were always draped with heavy curtains to keep him safe from drafts, the nurse had said, though Rosa suspected it was more to keep others from seeing him. That night, while the castle settled into its quiet routines, Rosa stood by the window in Errol's room, her hand on the curtain rope. "Have you ever been to the garden?" she asked. Errol shook his head, his eyes following her fingers. Only when I was a baby, they say, he murmured. I don't remember. Would you like to? Rosa asked. He hesitated. Father says the ground is uneven, that it is dangerous for me. Rosa thought of the way his eyes lit up when she told him stories of her village, the smell of earth after rain, the feeling of grass under bare feet. He had asked so many questions she could not answer from memory alone. Dangerous things can become gentle, she said softly, if someone is watching closely enough. Errol looked at her, then slowly nodded. I would like to see the garden, he whispered. That was all the permission she needed. She eased him into his wheelchair carefully. Each movement was slow, communicated, respectful of his limitations. She wrapped a thick cloak around his small frame, then guided the chair toward the door. The nurse, sitting in the corner mending a shirt, looked up sharply. Where are you going with him? For air, Rosa said. For the sky. The king hasn't approved. Then he can be angry with me, Rosa replied calmly. Not with Errol. The nurse's lips pressed into a tight line, but she did not move to stop them. Something in Rosa's quiet certainty made resistance feel pointless. The corridors were hushed and dim. Guards watched them pass with mixed expressions, curiosity, concern, disapproval. Rosa kept her focus on the path ahead, guiding the chair carefully around each stone, feeling every bump through the handles. They reached a smaller door near the back of the castle. Rosa pushed it open, and cool night air rushed in, carrying the sense of damp earth and distant flowers. Errol inhaled sharply, his eyes going wide. It smells different, he whispered. It smells alive, Rosa said. They rolled out into the garden. The moon hung low and bright, casting silver light over the neatly trimmed hedges and tall, ancient trees. Flowers of deep blue, pale white, and blood red glowed softly under the night sky. A stone fountain murmured in the center, its water catching moonlight like scattered diamonds. Rosa stopped the chair on a patch of flat stone, where the risk of catching a wheel was low. She moved to the front and knelt, adjusting the blanket over Errol's legs. He tilted his head back, eyes fixed on the sky. The stars look closer from here, he murmured. Rosa followed his gaze. They are the same stars I saw from my village, she said, but somehow they feel different when you don't have to share them with so many roofs. Errol smiled faintly. Do you miss it, your village? Every day, she admitted, and not at all sometimes. When I am with you, I forget to miss it for a while. He studied her face carefully, as if searching for any sign that she was pretending. When he found none, his smile grew a little. Tell me about it again, he said. The river, the old tree, the songs. So she did. She told him about the river that carved a silver line through her village, where children skipped stones and old women washed clothes. She described the great oak tree at the edge of the field, where she and her brothers used to climb and pretend they were kings and captains. As she spoke, Errol's eyes grew brighter, his imagination turning her words into colors and sounds that his body could not reach but his mind could hold. They were still like that, boy in a chair, girl on the stone, both wrapped in starlight, when a shadow fell over them. Rosa's voice faltered. Slowly she turned. The vampire king stood a few paces behind them, hands clasped behind his back. He wore no crown tonight, only a dark cloak that blended into the night. His eyes were unreadable. Rosa's heart leaped into her throat. My king, she said quickly, starting to rise. Stay, he said. She froze halfway, then lowered herself back to the stone. Errol looked from his father to Rosa, worry flickering across his face. Father, I wanted to. You wanted to see the garden, the king finished for him, stepping closer. And she brought you. It was not accusation. It was observation. But there was something else under the words, an ache, a question, a regret. I should have done this long ago, he murmured, almost to himself. He moved around the chair and came to stand in front of his son. From there, he slowly lowered himself to the ground, cloaked knees, touching the same cold stone Rosa sat on. For the first time since Rosa had met him, the vampire king sat at the same level as his child. Errol stared, almost disbelieving. "Father, you don't have to." "Yes," the king said softly, "I do." The three of them sat there in a small triangle under the moon. The silence between them felt different now, not heavy, not dangerous, but shy, like something new learning how to breathe. "The stars used to look like this when I was a boy," the king said quietly, his eyes turned upward. "Before the wars, before the curses, before the court decided that a king belonged more to stone than to sky." Rosa listened, surprised. No one in the kitchen had ever spoken of the king as a boy. To them, he had always been a fixed thing, eternal, unchanging, untouchable. "Did you climb trees?" Errol asked. The king's mouth curved slightly. "I climbed everything," he said. "Walls, towers, cliffs. The servants used to say there was more air in my lungs than blood." "What changed?" Rosa asked gently before she could stop herself. He looked at her. The question hung between them like a fragile lantern. "I became responsible," he said after a moment, "for a kingdom that survives in shadows, for treaties with humans who once wanted us all dead, for keeping my people alive, no matter how much fear it cost." His gaze dropped to Errol. "And then I became responsible for someone I did not know how to protect." Errol's fingers curled into his blanket. "I thought," the king continued, his voice rougher now, "if I kept you hidden, if I made the world small around you, you would be safe. But safety without sky is just another kind of prison." The words shook Rosa in a way she did not expect. They could have been spoken about any child she had known back home, hidden by parents who were afraid the world would laugh at what it did not understand. Rosa's voice was quiet but steady. "He doesn't need less world," she said. "He needs more hands when he faces it." The king stared at her for a long time. "You say simple things," he murmured, "but they are not simple to do." "Then we do them slowly," Rosa answered. "Together." The king looked back at the sky, exhaling. "Together," he repeated, as if trying on the word for the first time. They stayed there for a while, talking about nothing and everything. Errol pointed at constellations Rosa didn't know the names of, and the king quietly told them ancient stories of those stars, stories older than any human village, older than the castle itself. Rosa, in turn, told smaller, humbler stories. Festivals in her town, silly arguments with her brothers, the way her mother sang when she was too tired to talk. Somewhere in the middle of one of those stories, Rosa realized something. The king was listening. Not as a ruler collecting information, not as a judge weighing truth, as a man who had not heard simple human life in a very long time and found, to his own surprise, that it soothed him. Errol yawned, his eyes drooping. Rosa adjusted the blanket around him. The night had grown colder. "We should take him in," she said. "He's getting tired." The king nodded and stood, carefully lifting his son from the chair. "I will carry him," he said. "You push the chair." Together they moved back toward the castle, king with the child in his arms, human girl guiding the empty chair beside him. To anyone watching, it would have looked impossible, almost unbelievable. At the door, the king paused. "Rosa," he said, "you said you miss your village and not at all sometimes." He shifted Errol slightly in his arms. "If you ever wish to leave, if this becomes too heavy, you may go. I will not hold you here." Rosa looked at him, surprised by the offer. No one in power ever let go of useful things so easily. She thought of her mother, of her promise to send money, of the fear that had followed her since she entered this castle. Then she looked at Errol's sleeping face, relaxed against his father's chest. "I will stay," she said simply. "As long as he needs my hands, and you need someone to remind you to look at the sky." A strange, quiet light touched the king's eyes. He inclined his head. "Then stay," he said. They stepped back inside, the door closing softly behind them. None of them knew that in the shadows of the corridor, a pair of cold, watchful eyes had seen everything. And not everyone in the castle was ready to let this new tenderness live. Rumors spread through the castle like smoke. Some said the king had enchanted a human servant. Others whispered that the human girl had bewitched the prince. A few, lower in voice and darker in tone, suggested that the king was growing weak, that his heart, once feared, was softening in dangerous ways. Those whispers reached ears eager to hear them. One of those ears belonged to Lord Vaylor, an ancient vampire noble whose family had served beside the crown for generations. He wore his age like armor, his hair silver at the temples, his eyes a dull red that had watched too many changes and trusted none of them. He had never approved of the human treaties. To him, humans were necessary tools, not people to be protected, and he certainly did not approve of a human girl holding the heir to the throne. "This cannot continue," he said to the small circle of nobles gathered in his private chambers. "If the king grows too close to them, he will forget what must be done to keep our kind alive." "They say the human girl is kind to the boy," one of them murmured. "The prince smiles more, he sleeps better." "Kindness," Vaylor said sharply, "does not keep us from burning under the sun. Kindness does not protect us when humans change their minds and turn against us again." He leaned forward. "A king must be feared enough that no one dares to test the borders. If he begins to look human, they will see an opening." "And the boy?" another asked quietly. "He is fragile." Vaylor's eyes hardened. "Then we must make sure that those around him are strong, not easily moved by emotion." His thin lips curved into a cold line. "This Rosa Alvarez must be tested." The test came a few nights later. Rosa noticed the change before she understood it. Guards watched her more closely when she pushed Errol's chair through the corridors. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. A few servants, who had once smiled kindly at her, now avoided her eyes as if she carried something contagious. She tried to ignore it. Her focus stayed on Errol, helping him exercise his arms, reading to him from old storybooks in both her language and his, playing small games with the wooden figures his father had carved long ago. One evening, as she guided Errol's chair back to his chambers, 2 guards stepped into their path. "Stop," one of them said. His tone was respectful but firm. Rose's hands tightened on the handles. "Is something wrong?" "You are requested in the North Tower," the second guard said. "Alone." Rose's heart sank. "By who?" "By Lord Vaylor," the guard answered. "He speaks with the king's authority." Errol twisted in his chair, anxiety flooding his small frame. "No," he said quietly. "I don't like him." "SHH," Rosa soothed, squeezing his shoulder gently. To the guard, she said, "The prince cannot be left alone. He needs someone with him at all times." "The nurse will attend him," the first guard replied. "She is already on her way to his chambers." Almost on cue, the elderly nurse appeared at the end of the corridor. She hurried forward, her eyes moving quickly from Errol to Rosa, worry etched into every line on her face. "Go," the nurse whispered when the guards were not listening. "I will stay with him. Do not keep Lord Vaylor waiting. He looks for excuses." Rosa knelt beside the chair, bringing herself closer to Errol's eye level. "I'll be back soon," she promised. "You'll barely have time to miss me." Errol reached for her hand. She took it, letting his weak fingers curl around hers for a brief, comforting moment. "You always come back," he said. It was half hope, half question. "I always come back," she repeated firmly. She let go and stood, her stomach tight with unease. The guards led her away, their footsteps echoing through colder, narrower hallways. The air grew chillier, the torches spaced farther apart. Eventually, they reached a spiral staircase that wound upward into the North Tower. "You go alone from here," one of the guards said. "Lord Vaylor is waiting at the top." Rosa swallowed hard and began to climb. The stairs were steep and worn smooth by centuries of use. Her legs ached by the time she reached the top landing. There, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out. She pushed it open. Lord Vaylor stood by a large window that overlooked the courtyard. He did not turn at her entrance. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. "You are Rosa Alvarez," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lord," she replied, stepping inside. "You sent for me." Now he turned, his gaze sweeping over her in one long, assessing look. "So," he said slowly, "you are the human girl who has captured our prince's attention, and perhaps our king's as well." Rosa's spine stiffened. "I have captured nothing, my lord," she said. "I serve, that is all." "Yes," he said softly, "you serve, but sometimes service can be more dangerous than rebellion if the heart grows involved." He stepped closer. Rosa held her ground. "Tell me, Rosa Alvarez," Vaylor continued, "do you think yourself important now, close to the prince, sitting with the king in the garden? Whispers say he listens to you. Is that true?" Rosa blinked. "The king does not answer to me," she said carefully. "He is kind to his son. I am only there to help." "Kind," Vaylor repeated, tasting the word like something sour. "Kindness from a king can be mistaken for weakness, especially by humans." Rosa felt a small fire kindle in her chest. "Where I come from," she said gently but firmly, "kindness is not weakness. It is the only thing that keeps people alive when they have nothing else." His eyes narrowed. "Do you love the prince?" he asked suddenly. The question hit her like a hard wind. "He is like a little brother to me," she answered. "I would not see him hurt, not by anyone. Not even by his own limitations." Vaylor's voice sharpened. "You hold him like he is whole, but he is not. You give him dreams too big for his body. That is its own kind of cruelty." Rosa's hands curled into fists. "Believing he deserves joy is not cruelty," she said, her voice low. "Making his world small because you are afraid to see him struggle, that is cruelty." They stared at each other in the dim light. Vaylor's gaze grew colder. "The king has ruled for centuries," he said. "He knows what must be done. You have been here for weeks, and yet you dare to speak as if you understand what is best for us." "I don't know what is best for your kingdom," Rosa said. "I only know what is best for a child when he is about to fall." Vaylor stepped so close, she could see the faint veins beneath his pale skin. "Then let us test that," he whispered. Before she could react, he moved faster than human eyes could follow. In a blur, he was gone from before her and standing at the window, his hand pushing it open. Far below, the courtyard stones waited, hard and unforgiving. Rosa's heart lurched. "What are you?" "Tell me, human girl," Vaylor said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you had to choose between the safety of our kind and the feelings of one cursed child, which would you choose?" Rosa froze. It felt like a trap with no good answer. "If the humans grow bold," Vaylor continued, "if they mistake the king's new softness for weakness, it will be war. And in war, the first to suffer are the most fragile. Your prince, your family in the village, you speak of kindness, but kindness cannot stop what is coming if the king forgets to be feared." Rosa's mind raced. Behind his words, she heard the real question, "Whose side are you on?" "I am on his side," she said quietly. "On the prince's, whatever comes." Vaylor's mouth twisted. "Even if it means turning your back on your own people." Her chest ached. "I will not choose between them," she said. "I will fight for both in whatever way I can." "Naive," he murmured. "Dangerous." He moved away from the window. Listen carefully, Rosa Alvarez. You will keep your distance from the king, from any matters of rule. You will care for the boy, nothing more. You will not fill his head with dreams of gardens and stars he cannot reach." His voice hardened. "If you do, if I see you drag our king further into this human softness, I will not be as gentle as he is." Rosa lifted her chin a fraction. Fear burned through her, but something else did too. "With respect, my lord," she said quietly, "you cannot ask me to care for him and not care about him." His eyes flashed. "I can ask anything. This is my world, not yours." "This is his world too," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Prince S, and he is not a burden to be hidden while you protect your power." Something snapped in Vaylor's gaze. For a heartbeat, Rosa thought he might strike her. Instead, he stepped back and turned away. "Leave," he said, "and remember what I said." Rosa backed toward the door, her heart hammering. At the threshold, she paused. "My lord," she said softly, "you fear that the king will become weak if he remembers how to love. But from where I stand, a king who can love and still protect would be stronger than anything this kingdom has seen." She left before he could answer. In the long, dim stairwell, she pressed a shaking hand to the stone wall and took a deep breath. She had just spoken more boldly than any human had a right to in this place. But when she returned to Errol's room and found him wide awake, eyes red from holding back tears, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let fear, hers or Vaylor's, decide what kind of love this boy was allowed to receive, even if it cost her everything. The turning point came on a night when no one expected anything to change. A storm rolled over the mountains, dark clouds swallowing the moon. Thunder grumbled low and rain lashed at the castle windows. Inside, candles flickered and shadows swayed like restless ghosts. In the prince's chamber, Rosa sat on the edge of Errol's bed, a book open in her lap. Errol lay propped up on pillows, his eyes focused on her face more than the words she was reading. "And then," she said, closing the book with a soft thump, "the captain realized the treasure wasn't gold at all. It was the friends who had stayed with him when the seas were rough." Errol groaned slightly. "That is a terrible ending," he said with a tired smile. "It is a true one," Rosa countered. "True things are not always satisfying," he murmured. "No," she agreed, "but they are heavy enough to hold on to when stories are over." Lightning flashed, briefly painting the room in white. Errol flinched. Rosa reached out and gently smoothed his hair back. "Does the storm frighten you?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not the storm," he said. "The way lightning shows everything and then hides it again. I see the world for a second, then it is gone." Rosa understood that more than she could say. A knock sounded at the door. Before Rosa could respond, it opened and the vampire king stepped inside. He looked different tonight. The weight that usually sat on his shoulders seemed heavier, his eyes shadowed by something more than lack of sleep. "Father," Errol said, his face brightening, "you came." "I said I would," the king answered, his voice gentle. "Some storms are better when shared." He moved closer to the bed. Rosa stood automatically, giving him room, but instead of taking her place, he glanced at her. "Stay," he said. "He sleeps better when you are near." The simple acknowledgement warmed her more than the thickest blanket. The king sat on the other side of the bed. For a moment, the three of them listened to the rain against the windows. "How was your day?" the king asked Errol. The boy thought. "I moved my arm higher," he said. "Rosa helped." The king looked at Rosa, and something like pride flickered in his eyes. "Good," he said quietly. "Every small movement counts." Rosa hesitated, then spoke. "My king," she said softly, "may I say something without you ordering my head removed?" "One never knows with you," he replied dryly. "But speak." She smiled faintly. "Sometimes I think you are harder on yourself than on anyone in this castle." His gaze sharpened. "I do not have the luxury of being gentle with myself." "Maybe not," she allowed. "But he," she nodded toward Errol, "needs a father who can forgive himself for not being perfect." Lightning flashed again. Errol watched both of them, sensing the gravity of their words even if he did not fully grasp them. The king looked down at his son's thin hand resting on the blanket. His own hand hovered above it, then slowly settled atop it. His fingers were cool, but steady. "I failed to protect your mother," he said, the confession sounding like it had been buried a long time. "I have never forgiven myself for that. I swore I would never fail you." Errol's voice was small. "You haven't," he said. "You're here." The king's eyes closed for a heartbeat. "You cannot walk," he said. "Sometimes you cannot even lift your head. I should have found a way to break the curse." "Father," Errol whispered, "I don't need different legs. I need you to not look at me like I am a wound you cannot heal." The room went utterly silent. Rosa felt tears sting her eyes. The king's shoulders trembled once, very slightly. He looked from his son to Rosa, as if lost between the guilt of centuries and the truth of this small, fragile moment. "I am learning," he said at last, his voice unsteady, "that some things are not meant to be fixed, only held." He reached across the blanket, his hand resting closer to Rosa's now. Their fingers did not touch, but the distance between them felt smaller than it had ever been. Rosa spoke softly. "You told me once you are responsible for a kingdom that survives in shadows," she said. "But maybe the only way to truly protect it is to show them that even in shadows there can be light." "What light?" he asked, not in challenge but in honest doubt. She looked at Errol. "Him," she said, "and you like this." Another flash of lightning illuminated them. A king bowed close to his disabled child, a human girl standing nearby, not as a servant hiding in the dark, but as a witness, an anchor. At that exact moment, the door burst open. Lord Vaylor strode in, followed by 2 guards. His eyes took in the scene quickly. The closeness, the softness, the way the king's hand rested gently on his son S. "My lord," Vaylor said, not bothering to hide his disapproval. "Forgive the intrusion, but we must talk. The human villages grow restless. They sense weakness. They sense change." The king turned his head slowly. "You enter my son's chamber without knocking," he said, his voice calm but edged. "You interrupt his rest, and you accuse me of weakness in front of him." Vaylor's jaw tightened. "I accuse you of being distracted," he said, "of letting this human girl fill your ears with fantasies that have no place in our survival." Rosa's stomach dropped. She stepped back instinctively. Errol shrank into his pillows. "Father." "Enough," the king said quietly. "Rosa has done nothing but give my son what this castle forgot how to offer, warmth." He stood slowly, his presence filling the room. "You speak of survival, Vaylor. You forget that a kingdom that survives without a soul is already dead." Vaylor's eyes burned. "Love makes rulers weak," he insisted. "Humans will use it, they always do. This girl." "This girl," the king interrupted, his tone now carrying a power that made the candles flicker, "risked her life, her position, and her safety to catch my son when all my immortal guards froze. She did that with no promise of reward." His gaze moved to Rosa briefly, then back to Vaylor. "You speak of threats," he continued. "You see them in every shadow, but you are blind to the most dangerous threat of all." "And what is that?" Vaylor asked. "A king who forgets why he protects anything in the first place," the king said softly. "Without love, I am only a blade, and blades, Lord Vaylor, cannot raise children. They only cut." The room was utterly still. Rosa realized she was holding her breath. Vaylor studied the king carefully, then Rosa, then Errol. "If you continue down this path," he said, quieter now but no less intense. There will be consequences. The court will not all agree. Some will turn away. Our enemies will sense your softness. Let them sense it, the king replied. Let them come close enough to see that kindness does not erase my strength. It sharpens it. He stepped closer to Valor, his voice dropping to a quiet warning. But if anyone, noble or guard, so much as frightens my son, or threatens the human who holds him when I cannot, they will learn that my heart may be softer, but my judgment is not. Valor held his gaze. For a long moment, old power and new collided in the small chamber. Then slowly, Valor bowed his head. As you wish, my king, he said, though his eyes promised this conversation was not over. I pray you are not making a mistake. He turned and left, the guards following. The door closed behind them with a soft thud. The king stood in the middle of the room, breathing a little heavier than before. Rosa watched him, her own heart pounding. You defended me, she said quietly, the words tasting strange and unbelievable on her tongue. I defended my choice, he corrected gently. You are part of that choice. Errol reached out weakly. The king moved back to his side, and Rosa, almost without thinking, did too. She stood near the bed, her hand resting lightly on the blanket. The king looked at her, then at their hands, then at his son. Listen to me, he said, voice low, as if he were making a vow to all of them. There will be resistance. People who think I have lost my edge. They will talk. They may test the borders, both of this kingdom and of my patience. Rosa nodded slowly. I know, she said. I felt it already. But we will not answer them with more shadows, he continued. We will answer them with something they have never seen from a throne like this. What is that? Rosa asked. He looked at her with a steady, almost luminous gaze. A king, he said, who is not afraid to be a father. A kingdom that does not hide its weakest prince, but raises him in the open. And a bridge between human and vampire that is built not from fear, but from people like you. Rosa swallowed hard. People like me. People who run toward falling children, he said, not away. Thunder rolled softly in the distance, but the worst of the storm had already passed. The rain on the windows had become a gentle patter. Errol's eyes fluttered. I'm tired, he whispered. Rosa adjusted his pillow. The king sat again, closer this time. Together they watched as his breathing slowed, his small chest rising and falling in a quiet rhythm. Rosa spoke into the soft darkness. My king, even if the others don't understand, even if they never agree, this is the right thing. I know, he said. How? She asked. He looked at his sleeping son. Because for the first time in centuries, he answered, I am afraid of losing something that is not my power but my heart, and if my heart is finally awake, he exhaled slowly, then perhaps I am not the monster they whispered about after all. Rosa smiled quietly. Monsters don't worry about being monsters, she said. Fathers do. Their eyes met, and in that look something steady and unspoken passed between them. A partnership, fragile but real. Outside, the storm moved away. Inside, a different kind of storm settled into calm. In the days and years that followed, the story people told about the vampire king changed. They still spoke of his power, his long rule, his sharp decisions. But they also spoke of how he could be seen some nights in the garden, sitting beneath the stars with his son in his lap and a human girl by his side, all three of them sharing stories that crossed borders no map had ever drawn. They spoke of a disabled prince who grew not stronger in body, but stronger in spirit, loved openly by a father who learned to hold him without shame. And they spoke, quietly but with a kind of awe, of the night everything began to change. The night the vampire king walked into his hall and saw a human waitress holding his disabled child. And instead of turning that moment into a punishment, he let it turn him into something new, not less of a king, more of a man. And in the end, that was what saved them all.